There's a bunch of things that Americans really would like. And in fact, I think most of these, I'm going to go through this list, I think most of these are things that even Republicans would like. I mean, these are, some of them are partisan, but most of them are not. Number one, a requirement that every bill, every piece of legislation be, specific to what it's about. No more of this, 300 things jammed into one bill. Number two, becoming a citizen lobbyist. Well, that's good stuff. But let me get to the bills here. Number one, Restrict First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act. This was introduced by Ted Lieu, Ed Markey, and Walter Jones. Makes it illegal for any president to unilaterally authorize a nuclear weapons first strike. Number two, the Paycheck Fairness Act of 2017. This just amends the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 to say you can't discriminate against women. The Women's Health Protection Act of 2017. This protects a woman's right and ability to determine whether and when to bear a child or end a pregnancy by limiting restrictions on the provision of abortion services. The American Opportunity, that might be partisan, I don't know. The American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act. The Clean Energy for America Act, revitalizing clean energy. Ron Wyden introduced this. The previous one was Earl Blumenauer and Sheldon Whitehouse. Saving America's Pollinator Act, that's John Conyers. Government by the People Act, reform for the financing of congressional elections. This is John Sarbanes. Conflicts from Political Fundraising Act, Whitehouse and Deutsch. The Disclose Act of 2017, democracy strengthened by casting light on spending in elections, which is what Disclose stands for. That's Sheldon Whitehouse again is promoting that. The Presidential Tax Transparency Act, you got to submit your tax returns if you're going to run for president. The Presidential Conflict of Interest Act, the Automatic Voter Registration Act, Congressional Redistricting, and it goes on, Raise the Wage Act. There's a bunch of these pieces of legislation. So why will none of these pass? Because Republicans control Congress and the White House. So how do you get them passed? Well, the magic number, and a tip of the hat, by the way, to my friend Richard Green, who was here just before I guess it was 2 days before Christmas. We had breakfast together at Denny's, of all things. But anyhow, Richard, former Air America host, an old friend, he dropped by, and he said, my magic number now is 279. And I'm like, 279? And he's like, yeah, we need 218 Democrats in the House of Representatives. You need 60 Democrats in the Senate. So that's 218 plus 60, which is 278. And you need one Democrat in the White House, which is 279. 279 human beings, 279 people, men and women. If we can put them in those positions, 218 Democrats in the House, 60 Democrats in the Senate, one in the White House, all this stuff can be done. So then the question becomes, how do you get to 279? And the answer is fairly straightforward. If you look at opinion polls, what you find is that the vast majority of Americans, when ideas are presented to them as not being Republican or Democratic, but simply as ideas, as, here's a topic, tend to like them. For example, 79% of Americans think government should be allowed to negotiate drug prices. Republicans don't. They won't let Medicare negotiate drug prices. It's a way of damaging Medicare. 78% of Americans think that students should get the same interest rate as big banks. In other words, less than 1%. 77% of Americans, independent party, 77% of Americans think we should have universal pre-K. 75% of Americans think that we should have fair trade that protects workers, the environment, and jobs. 74% of Americans think we should end all tax loopholes that corporations use to ship jobs overseas. 72% of Americans think that everybody should be able to buy into Medicare. 71% of Americans think we should spend $400 billion this year on infrastructure. 71% of Americans think that all college should be free. 71%. I mean, we did this. We found that this actually worked with the GI Bill after World War II. It worked really well in California until Ronnie Reagan came along and became governor. The list goes on. 70% of Americans want to close offshore corporate tax loopholes. 67% of Americans want to retrain coal miners and oil workers for clean energy jobs. 66% of Americans think we should eliminate the Electoral College, which is the only reason that either George W. Bush or Donald Trump became president. Both of them lost the popular vote. Al Gore got 500,000 more votes. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes. And yet we ended up with Bush and Trump. Net neutrality. Now, this survey was taken in 2016. This was a year and a half ago. There's a national poll of likely voters, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, conducted by GBA Strategies on behalf of the Progressive Change Institute. 61% at that time of Americans wanted net neutrality. So it's not even, just some sort of partisan thing. It really is about doing the work of America. But because the Republican Party is owned by a group of billionaires and the corporations who made them rich, they don't want these things, right? Because these things don't enrich billionaires, or they slow down the rate at which billionaires are enriched. Instead, so instead we get policies that make billionaires richer and more immune and concentrate wealth in a small number of very, very wealthy families over a long period of time. So how do we solve that problem? 279. And how do we get to 279? Make sure that everybody you know is registered to vote. Check with your state, particularly if you live in a state that has a Republican governor or Secretary of State. Check in your state at least every 6 months and make sure that you are still registered to vote, because the Republicans are purging millions, literally. I was going to say hundreds of thousands. It was several 100,000 in Wisconsin, a couple 100,000 in Michigan, a couple 100,000 in Ohio, a couple 100,000 in Pennsylvania, so that Trump could win each one of those states after they purged hundreds of thousands of largely black Democratic voters and Hispanic voters. I mean, this is Chris Kobach's whole thing. So what we need to do is get people engaged. And I see that happening. I see it happening in a big way with the millennial generation. The website, by the way, for this is 279-4CHANGE, FORCHANGE.us. 279-4CHANGE.us. And thank you, Richard Green.